tankers brought water supplies into Tacloban because the water supply had been cut off. Members of the Philippines Army guarded the tankers so people could fill up in an orderly fashion, and they allowed people to charge their mobile phones off the army truck batteries because there was no electricity in Tacloban and nobody was bringing in generators. No one was responding to actual need. People needed generators. It made me think at the time, there must be a better way to help the world's most vulnerable people. And that's what this report thinks about too. We're going to discuss this report today, its recommendations and implications. Let me give you a little bit of background about it. It was commissioned by the UK Government Department for International Development, and it's the result of months of deliberations by a high-level panel led by CGD's Vice President and Director of our Europe programme, Owen Barder, who's over there. Currently, humanitarian aid totals around $20 billion a year. That's humanitarian aid, not development aid. How can the system keep pace with the changing nature of emergencies? That's what this is thinking about. What is that changing nature? Well, in short, more people are in need and for longer. Let's think about the 4 million plus who've fled Syria. Most of them, contrary to what the popular media would have us believe, are not flooding into Europe. Most are also not living in camps. The majority of Syrian refugees outside of Syria live amongst host communities in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. Lebanon's population is now 1/3 Syrian refugees almost. It places an unsustainable strain on those countries' infrastructures. And let's be clear, those refugees are not going home anytime soon. To help them, aid organisations deliver millions of tons of stuff: food, blankets, clothes, toiletries, toys. Yet in many cases, those things might be more easily available on the open market. If refugees could buy things on the open market, they might not be regarded by their hosts as a pariah community. And who says an aid agency knows better than a refugee what her family needs? There are questions too for donor countries. How can we do better in how we use and how we track public money that's spent on aid? This report thinks about all those points, and it says that giving cash instead could be more effective, more efficient, and more transparent. And it identifies 12 crucial steps to scaling up cash aid programs, including capitalizing on digital technology and the private sector's expertise. So let me introduce our panel. They bring different perspectives on the issue of cash aid. First, we'll hear from Owen Barder. I've already introduced him. He's the chair of the high-level panel and the main author of the report. He'll take us through the main recommendations in a minute. The Overseas Development Institute, ODI, co-published this report and was responsible for providing a huge amount of the information that went into it. Sarah Bailey from ODI has joined us, and she'll give us some more background to the consultations and the main conclusions. Dina Esposito, we welcome from the USG's Food for Peace program. She'll give us a response to the report and consider the challenges and opportunities of cash aid from her organization's perspectives. Radha Rajkotia from IRC, they built up expertise on how to do cash aid. She'll tell us more about their experiences and how to scale it up. And Satwik Seshasai, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Segovia. They provide the technology that is used by Give Directly, the organization that allows you to give directly to people in developing countries. It says what it does on the tin. I like that. He'll talk to us about how technology can help make cash aid secure and widespread. Each panelist will speak for a few minutes, then I may ask a couple of questions. We'll also get some comments from the audience, and we'll open up to questions as well for you. And we'll finish by around 11:30. So first, with that, Owen, can I invite you up to the podium? He's going to take us through the main recommendations of the report with a brief PowerPoint. Owen, thanks.
Thanks very much, Rajesh. Can you all hear me? Excellent. So I want to begin by thanking the panel members. Okay. Am I standing in the wrong place here? No? Okay. So I want to begin by thanking my fellow panel members. Can you turn down the feedback somehow? Sorry. That's better. No? Still not better? Saul? Is that? No, there isn't a mic there. That's a light.
Oh, Jesus, that'll be the door. Excuse me. Sorry.
Should I stand somewhere different?
No, there's a little bit of feedback coming from the speaker. We're just trying to sort that out. Apologies, everybody.
Sorry
you
about
can
that.
laugh at me walking into the door if you like for a little bit longer.
Let me try and get going by standing away from the speaker by saying that the panel discussions, we talked a lot about how cash might and in what circumstances make humanitarian aid better. But all through our discussions, we were very conscious that this is a system under enormous strain and pressure, and the needs are growing, and that part of the issue is that there are just insufficient resources currently being spent on humanitarian aid. And as I talk, I don't want to give the impression that the panel believed that making more use of cash transfers would solve all the problems that we face. We think it will make an important contribution, but there are a set of other issues, especially resources, that we also need to address. So I'd like to get that out there up front. This is a picture of Jijiga, a place in Ethiopia. I first visited it in 1985, 30 years ago. It's now got 3 refugee camps for Somalis, about 40,000 Somalis. Here they are protesting, a group of inhabitants protesting because of a lack of water. And one of the reasons I've put this up is because it's an interesting place. Since 2013, the World Food Programme and UNHCR have been running a program that's a mixture of giving people food and giving people cash. And so it's enabled DFID to do a comparison to see what the effects were of cash and food. And what they find in this particular context is that for this population, quite difficult circumstances, cash is about 25 to 30% cheaper for the aid agencies for the amount of food that people get. It saves about a quarter of the cost of delivering food. In the same place where you give people in-kind aid, whether that's food or blankets, toiletries, whatever, about 30 to 50% of that in-kind aid was being sold. Why? Because, as Rajesh was saying at the beginning, it wasn't exactly the thing that people needed at that time, so they're selling it to buy something else, often at an enormous discount on the cost that it cost us to bring it to them. So in some cases, they're selling it for about 30% of what it cost us to deliver those goods. In a different study, we were presented with evidence that 70% of Syrian refugees in Iraq had sold some of the in-kind aid they had received, and in an IRC study, 80% of Syrian refugees, when asked, said they preferred cash transfers to being given aid in kind. Now, I'm summarizing this evidence quickly. It's set out in a longer background note to the panel's report that's available both on the ODI website and the CGD website. One of the things that was interesting to me and interesting to us as a panel is that there are now hundreds of studies of cash transfers which don't uniformly find that it always works everywhere, but point in the same direction that there are many, many opportunities to use cash that we're not currently using. So the evidence is compelling. It isn't that cash will work in all circumstances, but when it does work, the panel found that it's often cheaper and safer to deliver, that it cuts down on overhead costs, that it gives people more of what they actually need rather than what we think they might need, that it helps stimulate the local economy by creating demand for goods and services for local traders and suppliers, whereas providing in-kind aid can often put those same people out of business. And the result of that is an increase in acceptance in the local community of refugee populations. That it can increase financial inclusion, especially when cash is delivered digitally. But most of all, and this is important, I think, it recognizes the agency and the dignity of the people we're trying to help. It gives them real choice to determine what their priorities and their preferences are, what kind of food, the trade-offs between food and shelter, water, health, and so on. So for us, it was really quite compelling evidence, and the consensus across the international system, the people we spoke to, that Sarah's going to talk about. And so a lot of our discussion was about how to bring about greater use of cash. There are 12 recommendations in this report. They're on page 4 of the report, and they're grouped into 3 parts. The first part is that we need to make more use of cash transfers. The data are quite difficult at the moment, but we estimate that about 6% of humanitarian aid is currently provided either in cash or as vouchers, and the rest is provided in kind. Now, there are many more cases than this where cash would be appropriate, and so a big part of the panel's report is that we can't let business as usual continue with such low levels of cash being provided in the humanitarian system. The panel said that we should change the presumption so that the question should always be asked, if not, why not cash, and if not now, when? So this was turning around, instead of asking the question, should we do cash, the question should be asked, why not cash? And the burden of proof, we argued, should be on those who argue that aid should be delivered in kind. So that's our first and most important recommendation. In the Lebanon at the moment, there are 30 different agencies providing cash transfers for 14 different objectives, from winterization to food to legal assistance. And so the panel believed that what we mustn't do is just use the existing humanitarian mechanisms to deliver cash transfers without also trying to rationalize the overlap and the duplication. We can't just have a whole series of overlapping agencies all doing the same thing. So our second set of recommendations were to do with improving the efficiency with which cash transfers are delivered through local systems. And what we recommend is that there should generally be a single, large-scale, unconditional cash transfer to target populations, and that should be the central component of future appeals, future emergencies. Now, obviously, in many cases, that will need to be accompanied by delivery of goods and services in kind. There are some services that markets won't deliver, either because the markets are too disrupted or because they don't make sense to be delivered through markets, vaccination or security. But the centerpiece of the humanitarian response in most circumstances should be a single, coherent cash payment. We also recommended that donors should begin to invest in preparedness for cash transfers, especially integrating with, wherever possible, government systems, safety nets, so that cash payments can be made through those systems. Our third set of recommendations were to do with the opportunity that moving to cash brings to solve some of the long-standing problems in the humanitarian system. Some of the problems of duplication, of overlap, of competition for resources. And we believed that we could, as we move to cash, make more use of partnerships with the private sector, who could specialize in delivery of cash to target populations, while aid agencies and international organizations can focus on what they're better at, identifying beneficiary groups and needs, and monitoring and evaluation and accountability for how the resources are used. So we see part of our recommendations are about, as we move to greater use of cash, using that to rationalize and reduce costs in the international system. So these 12 recommendations, divided into these 3 groups, we believe could make a huge difference. I want to emphasize that we're not saying that cash will be appropriate in every circumstance, but we do believe that it would be appropriate in substantially more circumstances than we're using it now. We don't believe that business as usual will get us there. We don't think that business as usual will give us a scale-up of cash that is appropriate. We don't think that business as usual will deliver cash efficiently, and we don't think that business as usual will seize the opportunity that cash gives us of helping to improve the international system. These recommendations, we believe, if pursued, would enable the world to move to a much more effective humanitarian aid system, restoring to target populations real choice and dignity about how they use resources. We've got the World Humanitarian Summit coming up in Istanbul in May next year. It's a massive opportunity, perhaps a once-in-a-generation opportunity for us to rethink the humanitarian system. We think that shifting to cash transfers should be an essential part of it. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks very much, Owen. Thanks for bearing with the feedback issues. I'm going to be stepping very gingerly now, so to make sure I don't walk into any more obvious pieces of furniture. So Owen was taking us through the main recommendations in the report there. Let's invite Sarah Bailey now from ODI. Stay seated, please, to give us some more background to the report, where it came from, why it's needed, the element of consensus within the report, and who's on the panel, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Sarah, thanks.
Wonderful, and thank you so much for having me here. So I work with the Overseas Development Institute. If you're not aware of ODI, it's a think tank based in London that works on humanitarian and development issues. And our role in this is that we acted as the secretariat for the panel. So the panel was a process that took place from about February of this year to the report being released in September. And through this, we consulted about 200 people, some of them who are in the room today, to essentially ask their views around these questions. What does cash transfers mean for humanitarian action? What should they look like moving forward? We also did roundtables so we did one here, Nairobi, Geneva, Rome, New York, as well as doing individual interviews, written submissions. And so all of this was feeding into the panel process. We had background notes that are all available online, so it's quite transparent on both who was on the panel, ranging from Andrew Natsios, former head of USAID, as well as Jan Egeland, former Undersecretary General, and then what information we were providing to them to form the basis of the discussion. And it was the consultation with people in the humanitarian sector and beyond that really formed the backbone of the meetings and the discussions that the panel had over that time. So I'd like to step back and kind of situate this in terms of kind of where cash transfers is coming from, and then some of the elements that came out of that process that are in the report, but came out also via the consultations. So this is not a new question. Most of the people in this room will be familiar with cash transfers, and the kind of the discussion on cash transfers has been going on. A turning point was the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, when cash transfers were piloted as an alternative to food aid. And this is not the first time that they've been used. You can find examples in humanitarian response in the 90s and the 80s. You can go back to the 19th century, Franco-Prussian War, and you can probably go back to some Roman times. So it's not a new thing in that respect. But it is quite new that it's gained acceptance as a humanitarian tool. These types of discussions were not really possible 10 years ago without someone raising their hand and coming up with some, what about, concerns. And we still hear concerns, and they're legitimate and should always be raised. But it wasn't about what should this look like moving forward. The question was, should this be something that's moving forward as a tool? What wasn't really discussed is what would this mean for humanitarian response and the humanitarian system? And by that, I'm not really referring just to the US government and the way the USG is organized for aid, but that kind of messy picture of United Nations agencies, various donor governments, national governments, delivering their own domestic responses and working with international agencies, NGOs. So all of this system kind of together. What does it mean if we have a tool that's slightly different than the way that we're operating? What does it mean for the way we fund response and we organize it? And evidence has played a really key role in this discussion and moving it forward. As Owen indicated, cash transfers have really been under the microscope when you look at sort of humanitarian response. And he cited a few of the kind of basic things emerging. But you can look at evidence related to food consumption outcomes, evidence related to, what does it mean for markets, inflation, women, risk, security, protection. And I'm not going to go through all of that, but we'd be here all day. But we could, if you have any specific questions, in the Q&A, happy to discuss. But the main picture there is that cash can bring, it can be an appropriate response, obviously not always, and it can bring some quite specific advantages related to its flexibility, related to often being cheaper to deliver. And this ranges from kind of some small rinky-dink evaluations done for not a lot of money to randomized control trials that cost millions of dollars, pointing in this kind of direction. And that the kind of risks and concerns that have come out of the discussion have not ones that have really played out in practice related to inflation and specific disadvantages. So, and this is also complemented by a heck of a lot of evidence from social protection and development, so the use of cash transfers for poverty reduction. And we've seen that this is all really positive. Aid agencies are increasingly adopting cash as a tool that they're using, from World Food Program to UNHCR, donors as well. So that's great. And you might be wondering then, why bring together 15 of the best and brightest to mull through this kind of common sense response that's supported by evidence? And the answer to that is that it's underutilized and it's not being done in ways that are maximizing its potential. And I think the strongest example for this is the Somalia famine. That remains the largest use of cash transfers led by the international humanitarian community. So if we exclude domestic responses such as Pakistan. And that's also one of the hardest contexts in the world. And even then, it took aid agencies being backed up against a wall with people dying, with evidence that cash could work, experience that it had worked in the past, and even then there were delays in doing it, and that's because it's not the natural way that we're moving forward. And there it was quite risky, but we should be seeing that sort of large-scale experience in less risky and complicated places, and that to date remains, I think, one of the largest. So some of the issues that came up in the consultation and some of the challenges moving forward were quite particularly related to leadership. Saying that, well, if we have evidence, where does this, what about in the incentives? Incentives for doing the right thing, incentives for not saying what am I good at doing and where do I fit in, but what should be done in this setting and where do I fit into that? That flexible, unconditional cash transfers, so as opposed to say giving someone a voucher, that brings some quite specific advantages, but absolutely challenges divisions between aid agencies and in some cases donors that are structured around specific sectors such as food. So while it might seem logical that in Lebanon, UNHCR and WFP perhaps shouldn't be one providing a voucher, one providing cash, one using an e-voucher system, the other one using an ATM card, common sense, we might be able to bring some of this together in a slight different way, but that is happening for a reason. And I think what really came out, both in the panel discussions and the consultation, was opportunities. So a lot of this isn't specific to cash. If you look at potential for a stronger role for safety nets in disaster response, which we see a lot more in, say, in Kenya, Ethiopia, where safety nets providing cash and food, by the way, can be used and are scaling up in disaster response. Investment in preparedness. None of that is necessarily specific to cash, but we're seeing the cash could be kind of a positive Trojan horse for making progress on some of these thornier issues related to, say, the role of national government supporting them in responses, better links with the private sector, and certainly improved coordination. But the concern, both from the panel and people we consulted, was if there's not some positive proactive action, things are just going to kind of move forward in the humanitarian system in a more fragmented way. And we're not saying, it needs to be one agency doing this. If anything, no one wants a single lead agency within the humanitarian system. But there should be a possibility to take advantage of some of the more coherent approaches to helping people related to cash transfers. But we can't underestimate how easy it'll be to just simply recreate some of our existing weaknesses in the humanitarian system related to inefficiency and related to doing things the way we do them, as opposed to taking advantage of this. So thank you very much.
Okay, Sarah Bailey, thank you very much. Radha Rajkotia from IRC, you guys evaluated a cash trial amongst Syrian refugees in Lebanon. It provided valuable evidence for this report and about what works. I'd like to ask you, if you could, for a few minutes, talk to us about IRC's thinking about how to scale up cash aid. So we've talked about the kind of big picture of the report. Let's get into some of the specifics now about people who've got experience of doing this kind of stuff. So Radha, if you can talk to us about that, that would be great.
Okay. So I think from the IRC's perspective, we're really focused on letting the evidence around what works drive our decision making. And so the investment that we've made in using cash during humanitarian response has been embedded within our organizational strategy now, given the amount and extent of evidence that both Owen and Sarah have talked about, and the evidence of not just its effectiveness, but also its cost effectiveness. And within that, I want to be clear that we've been very specific. We're not saying that we think that cash should replace any and all of our interventions across the board. We're being very specific about which kinds of outcomes we think it will serve best, and that's, again, driven by the evidence. So we're focused very specifically on food security outcomes, on the basic needs outcomes around housing, NFIs, water, in the immediate aftermath of crisis. So we're not making a claim, and we're not suggesting agency-wide that we should be making pushes in health, education, or protection where the evidence is still not quite there, not quite sufficient for us to be able to make those sorts of operational changes. So that's one piece of it. So the specificity about outcomes has been really critical for us. And now that we've gotten to that point, the agency has, as a whole, made a decision to make a push, and within that, use research and evidence to try and be much more instrumental about the gaps that we're trying to fill. So really try and work out what is now stopping us. If we can say we think that in certain cases, cash is the better response to use, why aren't we doing more of it? Right? What's really stopping us, and what is it as an operational agency that we need to learn and change so that we can get there? And now the answers, as we've kind of dissected that, the answers are really far-reaching, and some of them are very practitioner and programmatic. So it's things that we all struggle with. How do we best target and identify beneficiaries? How can we make sure that we are working with existing digital financial services in any setting and being prepared to work with them so that we can be quick in our responses? But other questions are much trickier, and it's about things like how we can change attitudes and perceptions to the use of cash. And that can be both within our own organization, but then also with the counterparts that we have in the field, our donor partners. And there, I think we've had to dig a little deeper to think about, what the kind of iconography is around aid. What are the kind of perceptions that people have, and how do we change those images of, the relief that's being given? We've all got those, internal newsletters and external newsletters of the image with, someone giving out a jerry can with a smile on their face. And how do we change that to an image where actually it's somebody, a beneficiary, that's more empowered to make the choice that they want about what aid they need? Similarly, the questions or concerns about leakage or fraud that are often the kind of, they're the sort of monster in the cupboard. They're the one that it's the unknown fear that's hard to quantify and hard to respond to, but one that we really need to address in order to change people's perceptions about how we go about increasing the use of cash. So what are we doing? So those are the more tricky kind of perception-based issues that I think we need to address. But more tactically, I think as well, we are focusing pretty heavily on our operational capacity. So thinking about what is it that, how can we improve operational capacity and really benchmark that? So at the moment, there is a push. We certainly want to say, yes, let's do more cash, but more is not good enough. We also want to do it better. So we've done internal studies that have looked at our own operations and looked at the amount of time that it takes for cash to be delivered and also the cost. So we've seen some of the cost effectiveness results for external studies, but we've seen from our own studies as well that getting cash out to populations post-emergency can take up to 35 days. Just the actual assessment, targeting processes, the establishment of those partnerships with financial institutions, 35 days after an incident like Typhoon Haiyan. It's just not good enough. And so that's something that we want to try and get better at. And so it's about thinking about each step of that process to understand how is it that we can improve on those. And so we're working with partners to establish research, very rapid operational research, and new forms of practice so that we can test and iterate and try and improve in those areas. The second thing, I think, is also thinking beyond our own operations, so trying to look at how we're working with different partners. So we've heard in the conversations, the discussions from Owen and from Sarah, that this isn't just about, it's not just about the UN, it's not just about NGOs, it's about the financial infrastructure, it's about safety nets and host governments, and none of us know who should really be providing cash. Who's best placed to do this after a crisis? And so we want to get better at answering that question so that we can understand not just what are the best ways of doing it, but in what context does it make sense for the government of Pakistan to be playing a larger role than the NGO working groups that might have been established for many years. One point that I think is really key to our work is also around the preparedness piece. So what we've been focused on there, and I think where we would want to push, I think, some of the panels, the reports, recommendations, are really in thinking about preparedness as part of the development agenda. So getting beyond humanitarian sector and really thinking about how agendas around resilience, around financial inclusion can be considered humanitarian preparedness. So often we hear the typical sort of transition is if we get people into cash transfers and using digital financial services, then they can eventually become financially included. And we want to flip that a little bit and say, well, if we have stronger investments in financial inclusion already, how can we ensure that those are resilient and strong enough for humanitarian response so that we can actually use them when needed? Again, this requires us to be able to understand what's happening, what's going on with financial providers in the financial infrastructure, and think about what those incentives might be to actually change investments so that they are more ready for humanitarian response. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, Radha, thank you very much indeed. Give her a round of applause. Satwik Seshasai, CTO of Segovia. How can digital technology help make cash aid more widespread? Is there is the technology there to make it secure? Is that a reality? What are the innovations that can be used, and what are the drawbacks and the issues? If you can talk to us for a few minutes about that, that'd be great.
Sure, and I'd like to actually start by saying that the question as you presented it is often presented to me as the engineer, the technologist in the room. Well, what are you bringing to the table? What are the tools, and how is that going to help with doing our job? And my answer to that is always that this is something we need to work on together. I'd actually challenge folks in the audience as you listen to some of the tools and capabilities I described. I'd invite you to think about how we together can work on implementing the tools in the right way, because this isn't about the technology tools. This is about the mission we all share, the humanitarian mission of getting aid to the right people, the most vulnerable people in the world. And what we see with cash is, as Owen mentioned, actually you used the term once in a generation opportunity. And I think that's a great way to describe from the technology side all of the innovations in technology that have mostly benefited the developed world, those of us who have mobile smartphones, who use Google and Facebook. This is a once in a generation opportunity to bring some of those key technological innovations to the population that we're all looking to serve. And so one of the key things that I think we've heard mentioned a couple times here is with cash, you have the ability to deliver aid directly to those who need it, and you have the ability to test various different types of programs in a much more efficient way, because your supply chain is basically delivering cash, challenging, but significantly different than delivering food, delivering other in-kind aid. And so from a technology perspective, as we think about what are the different types of capabilities that we should be bringing to the table, I'm going to walk through 5 different ones that I think together really add a lot of value to this space. So the first is around identity. We've heard mentioned here today that cash brings agency and cash brings dignity to the beneficiary. With technology, we also have the ability to really establish an identity for the beneficiary. So what that often means is you have a national ID card, you have a number. If you're lucky, there's a biometric system in place, and we've taken your fingerprint or your palm or your iris scan. But when we think about identity at Segovia, what we're really thinking about is the overall context of who you are as a beneficiary, all the data that we've collected across multiple programs, across multiple visits, and the aggregation of all of that data, which helps form a composite picture of who you are, of what your needs are, helps inform market assessments, helps inform the effectiveness of aid in the monitoring and evaluation, and also helps serve as the unique identifier for an individual in cases where you don't have the biometric technology or the national ID that's a robust system. So we actually I think of identity as a much broader concept than just that kind of physical card or biometric ID. I mentioned the integration of data, and that's something that I want to emphasize, as we have future discussions, later today. When we think about technology, we're not just thinking about the tools, we're thinking about the data that's being brought together because of the tools. So if we think about some simple examples of tools that are out there today, digital data collection, we're working with IRC in Pakistan, and they have a pretty robust system of national IDs with NADRA, and they have a lot of compelling, interesting, useful data with the social program that's in place there. With technology, we have the ability to bring all of that data together. There's a lot of complexities around mapping data, your identity and your data in the NADRA system with what might have been collected with a digital tool from a humanitarian agency. But there's a number of different technological advances which have allowed us to aggregate this data and to understand the full picture around a beneficiary. And so as we talk about how do we make cash more effective, how do we deliver it more efficiently, how do we target it to the right populations, how do we assess how much cash to give, having that full picture is a critical component, and having technology allow us to aggregate data is a key piece of that. Now on the financial side, which is really thinking about how do you actually deliver cash most effectively, the one thing that I'm sure all of you understand probably much better than I do is that the local context is critical for understanding what the most effective way to deliver cash is. It could be through mobile money. It could be through physical cash. It could be through a local bank. It could be through one or more of those options. It could even be through vouchers in certain situations. And one of the things we hear a lot about with cash is that the market needs to be ready for whatever type of modality is being used, and the capability needs to be in place. The mobile network operator needs to have coverage. The bank needs to have a way to send information to the bank. One of the things that we're working on at Segovia and that we've found helps really scale out cash programs is the ability to manage the payment information, the decisions you want to make around payments, independent from the actual payment modality and the transmission of instructions to those different payment providers. So a simple way to think about this is imagine if you go into a country and there's a mobile network operator who says, look, I've got coverage across the country. All you need to do is build the technology to register beneficiaries and then send us payment instructions, and you're going to cover the country. The reality is almost always going to be that there's going to be certain counties, there's going to be certain villages where the agents aren't in place, or if the agents are in place, the liquidity is a challenge. And you really need to understand by being on the ground, not just how do we technically check the box that we've gotten cash to the population, but how do we actually make sure that they can receive the cash they need and spend it appropriately. And what that often leads to is a hybrid situation where you have a dominant kind of financial provider, but you might have other financial providers who are helping you run a countrywide program, a county-wide program. And using technology to federate the instructions across to those different providers and to track all of that effectively and to understand not just that the payments have been sent, but the full round trip, the payments have actually been cashed out and the beneficiaries have received the cash. all of those different capabilities are really what we see as another one of the core needs in actually having cash scale out and have cash have the impact that we want it to have. And then finally, I want to end on security. I think security is a term that everyone loves to throw around. We hear data protection mentioned a lot. The EU has made a number of changes recently to change the responsibilities of data protection in the various organizations in the sector. And the way it's often brought up in the discussion on cash is, well, isn't this just an easier way for cash to get into the wrong hands? Delivering cash digitally, it could be sent. Someone could change the account number, and cash should be given to terrorists or to others who shouldn't have it. And one thing I'd challenge everyone to think about is, think about this world as compared to all of the financial transactions that happen digitally through our international credit card system, through our banking system. Think about all the Know Your Customer advances that have been put into place. Think about all of the anti-money laundering and the fraud detection that's been put to bear in ensuring that the trillions of dollars in transactions that are done every day are secure. And now, think about everything I've said up until now about identity, about data aggregation, about really developing that full picture of who the beneficiary is, what the full context is. And what you end up with is the ability to actually understand and predict, not just is this phone number or is this name on the US specially designated national list. We can do that. We can check the box that this isn't a name that we've encountered before. But we can do a lot more in ensuring the integrity of the transactions that we're sending, and ensuring that every decision that's made leading up to a payment is done in a secure system where only the right people are making that decision and only the right beneficiaries are receiving the aid. So I'd challenge everyone as we get into the discussion to think about these different tools not just as the solution, but as tools that we can use to actually meet the humanitarian outcomes that we all together seek to meet.
Great, Satwik, thank you very much. Dina Esposito from Food for Peace. Let's get your response to this report. What are the challenges, what are the opportunities you see in the report from doing more cash aid, especially given the issues surrounding US food aid? Thanks.
First, thank you to CGD and to ODI for inviting USAID to participate in this panel. Perhaps what is uniquely American is that this issue of cash transfers is very caught up in the agenda of food aid reform. And so in that regard, you're going to hear from me from a Food for Peace perspective. My colleagues from the Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance are here, deeply involved in cash transfers as well, and they could just have easily been up here making remarks about this important report. Collectively, we really welcome this report and its findings. It very much contributes to building the strong body of evidence around why cash-based assistance is important, and discusses why humanitarian assistance needs to evolve, and it offers one important dimension, as we've noted, not the only dimension, but one important dimension that we have to grapple with. It's very timely in the run-up to the World Humanitarian Summit. For those of you who may not know how U.S. humanitarian assistance is organized, just a quick word. Food for Peace has global responsibilities within the U.S. government to address global food security needs. Our sister office in the same bureau, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, handles the non-food relief requirements for people affected by conflict inside their countries or by natural disasters. Together, we account for roughly half of all humanitarian assistance from the U.S. government. We're about $3 billion collectively. The other half of the coin is the State Department Bureau for Population, Refugees, and Migration. They lead on assistance to refugees, people who have crossed borders. And they also deal with the refugee admissions process to the United States. That said, Food for Peace works very closely with the Refugee Bureau because we actually have the responsibility to feed the refugees. All of this is to say that if you are wondering why it might be challenging for the U.S. to grapple with the findings of this report, it's because multi-purpose cash immediately gets you into issues of either blending resources across offices or rewriting mandates of various U.S. offices. It's almost unavoidable. Both of these are very thorny issues, probably not enough time to go into, but just to flag. So while the Europeans are probably better organized to grapple with the vision of this paper, the US is not without means to also do so, and even without institutional change, we are very substantial players in the cash space. 5 years ago, Food for Peace would have had nothing to contribute to this debate because its appropriations were completely tied to US food assistance. So our presence on the stage is in fact somewhat remarkable and indicative of the change that's happening here. In 2010, our Congress provided Food for Peace International Disaster Assistance Funds, IDA funds, the same resources that OFDA uses for its responses, which allowed us to do local and regional procurement of food closer to a disaster, cash transfers, or food vouchers. Last year, we received more than $800 million in IDA assistance. More than $500 million of that went for the voucher program for Syrian refugees, or for the local and regional procurement of food baskets for people inside Syria. Food for Peace spent in fiscal year 14 $78 million in pure cash transfers, twice the amount of the previous year, and $338 million in voucher programs. We supported purely cash transfers in Ebola-affected countries, in Somalia, in Kenya, parts of the Sahel, and of course vouchers in other areas. I think our food security mandate leads us perhaps more naturally to both vouchers and conditional food transfers, and we see them as perhaps more desirable in certain contexts than the authors of the high-level panel would like to see. Vouchers still offering significant efficiency and choice for beneficiaries, and in some environments better addressing issues of quality, inflation, or insecurity. Quite frankly, they are potentially more in keeping with the expectations of our congressional mandates. The flexibility we do have comes not only from the IDA account, but also from the Farm Bill. While most of our $1.4 billion from the Farm Bill is tied to the U.S. food aid commodities, we did receive $100 million in new flexibilities in the Farm Bill in 2013. There are some restrictions on how that $100 million can be used. And if you've been watching the recent Ag Committee oversight hearings, I would say it is quite clear that there may be interest by some members of Congress to forestall further change or maybe even roll back the flexibilities that we have in the Farm Bill. This might be a good time to note that the U.S. does not do cash transfers for its own hungry populations. We have a SNAP program also funded under the Farm Bill. It's essentially a voucher-based program. There are many opponents to the scope and scale of SNAP, and those who oppose further flexibility to U.S. humanitarian assistance often argue that should humanitarian aid look more like SNAP, or in this case, an all-cash-for program, it is an open question as to whether we could sustain strong congressional support for humanitarian assistance. I completely agree with the high-level panel report findings that cash is held to a higher standard than in-kind aid. There are ongoing efforts in the U.S., I'll be frank, to discredit cash-based transfers, flagging real or potential fraud, and in the hopes that it will just go away. We in no way object to shining a spotlight on it. Our point, however, is to say, what can we do to make this highly relevant and cost-efficient modality work even better? Not look at its weaknesses in order to roll it back. So your body of work, I think, can be very helpful in that regard in terms of making the case. On the plus, I think that also I wanted to note that we are overcoming some of these challenges by partnering with OFDA to do multi-purpose cash transfers with OFDA and Food for Peace, roughly dividing up, in this particular country context, so much for food, so much for non-food. And so we're evolving in that regard. Just a few, two concerns to close with. One is this idea of a supply versus a demand-driven approach. While the paper is arguing for cash as a way to assure a demand-driven approach, empowering people to choose what it is they want, I would argue that if we are not careful, it can become a supply division approach, a supply approach. In other words, there's a danger that we end up so committed to the cash principle that we ignore the context-specific signals on the ground that should drive our decision-making, or choose to only work in those sectors where we can advance the cash agenda. In other words, if it does not advance this agenda, we're not interested. And I know that's not what the paper says, but I do feel, and I have seen it in certain very specific instances, that we may be, the advocacy is perhaps clouding our judgment about how best to respond. So we just graduated from a supply-side approach in the United States. Let's not adopt another one right out of the box. And then my second concern I would flag is, and final point, is just are we using the possibility of efficiencies of cash as a cover to avoid the hard realities that needs are rapidly outpacing donor resources? So no matter how flexible we are, if we're providing a multi-purpose cash transfer that is far, far below what a refugee needs, there's going to be a crisis. We think that one of the reasons perhaps our humanitarian budgets have been sustained in the United States is because we are taking a sectoral look. We're saying so many people need food assistance, so many people have other needs, there are protection requirements, legal requirements, whatever, related to refugees. So it is my perception, and perhaps I am willing to stand corrected, that European budgets have perhaps failed to keep pace with extraordinary growth because they are not doing that kind of subsector analysis to drive a larger budget to respond to needs. I've told our funders, and I hope that Europeans are likewise telling their funders, that we are not going to efficiency our way out of the problems that the world is currently facing. Reforms, yes, are vital, and they can save us critically needed funds, but they will not rectify by themselves the funding shortfalls we have. So in closing, I've been very clear to Congress that we are still missing opportunities in the United States. In no way to diminish the importance of this report. We are missing opportunities to be more appropriate and cost efficient because we lack flexibility in our appropriations. And I believe that the paper you're launching here really does offer new opportunity for us to dig deeper into these issues and continue on this agenda of better serving the needs of vulnerable populations. So thank you.
Thank you, Dina, for that dose of US political reality. And thank you, panel, for all your comments. Excellent. I'm going to open straight up to the audience. First of all, I'm going to invite Gawain Kripke from Oxfam, who's in the corner right at the back there, to give us a couple of comments. And then I'm going to invite questions from members of the audience as well, and we'll put them straight to our panel. Gawain, thanks.
Great, thanks. Just huge congratulations on the paper, which I think is a real landmark in the discussion around cash transfers and use of cash in humanitarian situations. We've been exploring and arguing for this for some time, and I think Esposito's comments are well taken here. I find sometimes a mismatch between the sort of development discourse in the UK or elsewhere in the US, where there seems like very different conversations going on. And I ask a question for all the panelists, but also thinking on both sides of the Atlantic and elsewhere. What do you think is the main obstacle for why cash hasn't taken off more? If there are efficiencies and benefits both to the recipients and to donors and so forth, what's holding us back? Is it just lethargy and inertia, or is there something deeper? I'd be interested in exploring that issue.
Just before we get some answers to that, Gawain, let me just ask a question to you as a representative from Oxfam. You know, one of the things the report does, it kind of challenges the traditional architecture of humanitarian response. What are the implications of that for organizations like yours?
Yeah, there are many clarion calls right now about how stretched the humanitarian system is. And so the problem has several diagnoses. This is one dimension, I think, thinking about better modalities for delivering aid. The overall resource gap and the overall resource mismatch between the need and the increasing demands, I think, is another one. And yet another one that we've been focused on recently is trying to build more resilience into the system, and in particular empower and support local actors rather than sort of international actors, including INGOs like Oxfam, in the system. How do we effectively do that? So I think in front of the Humanitarian Summit next year, there's several different dimensions of questioning, and I think this is a core one around cash, but it's not the only question in front of us. So, and we are doing a lot of introspection. I think all of us have to at this point, because if you're involved in the humanitarian system, you realize that we just aren't doing the job that we feel that we need to. So that's maybe not quite the answer you wanted, but yeah.
Okay, it'll start us off. Thank you very much. Owen, Sarah, and Radha, what are the reasons that cash is not done more if it hasn't taken off? That was Gawain's question.
So I think we have a system that is designed to deliver stuff. And the people, the individuals who work in that system know and understand and by and large agree with the advantages in many circumstances of delivering cash, but they're in the system they're in. The people on the ground are reporting to middle managers back in headquarters who are doing their best at a time of far too few resources to get as many resources as they can from donors to meet humanitarian needs. And if you're the World Food Programme, you are going to set out a programme about delivering food because that's how you're going to get funding from donors. And so what we've got is an equilibrium that is, I think, suboptimal, but it's the equilibrium that everybody's in, and no individual organisation, no NGO, no individual delivery organisation can change that equilibrium on their own. What we need is, as a community, to decide we're going to change together. The donors have to indicate that they're prepared to fund cash at a large scale, and then international organisations, NGOs working with the private sector, need to work together to find new, innovative, better ways of delivering that cash. But so we all need to jump together, but we're stuck in a suboptimal equilibrium, is my answer to your question.
So I think there's a few things. I don't think there's any one thing. I think the issue of knowing how to actually do it. So I think once we get past the goodwill and the intent, and then it's how do we actually deal with the issues that Dina's talked about at the global level have very real implications at the field level. So once we're thinking about we may all agree, every NGO implementing in whichever country may agree to use more unconditional cash. But then if they are funded differently and from various sources, and then think, well, I want to do unconditional cash, but actually I can't use this for food, or I've got to guarantee that this isn't going to go towards, pharmaceuticals, or the various constraints that exist or are mandated globally have operational implications on the ground. So I think that's being aware of how to navigate those policy barriers locally and globally is certainly one thing. A second thing is also about just pure operations. We're not set up to the same mandate issues or the planning issues that the US government faces, are also faced by the UN, also faced by sectors within any one NGO. So I think even thinking about IRC's own experience, we need to think carefully about when we're advocating and instituting a why not cash justification across our own agency, in that very small way. What does that mean for our colleagues in WASH? What does that mean for our colleagues in the emergency team, not in the food security livelihoods team? So I think just actually working out how to make those changes and operationalize them is something that we need to consider. The third thing I would say, and I'll stop with that, is just around the issue of targets. And I think that the report has been very clear about not wanting to set targets. And I think that there is good reason not to. I think there's also very many good reasons to set targets. And I think one of them is to help guide where exactly and how important these different barriers are. So how much do we need to invest in the policy push that we need to make? How much do we need to invest in the preparedness elements that are really holding us back, or the operational capacity? So happy to talk about that more afterwards. But
I think there's a couple of people on the panel who might disagree with you
Yeah.
about targets. Let's maybe air some of those opinions. Owen or Dina or Sarah, would you like to chime in on that?
Just to know about what's holding us back, I do think we're in a different world than we were 20 years ago. We have huge private sector investments in some of these areas where we do humanitarian relief. We have integrated financial markets. We have markets, commercial markets that are responsive. There's a new opportunity to do more cash transfers. So it's not that we never saw it before. and suddenly, I mean, I just think that the context has changed, and we need to remember that too. Yes, mandates hold us back. Yes, even I would argue cultural issues in the United States hold us back. But fundamentally, the situation on the ground has changed, and I think those are the messages we need to harness and make clear about why now is the moment to push ahead. I do think, the targets, it's a mixed bag for me. On the one hand, it's always good to have a target, right? People will push for it. On the other hand, in our case, we're really trying to say that flexibility is about the right tool at the right time for the right condition. And if we suggest that we're choosing a target, suddenly you're skewing. Again, it's the supply side approach. We're really just graduated from a supply side approach. I really don't want to go back to one. So I think we would be reluctant, but certainly understand from an advocate point of view why that might be useful.
Did you want to chime in, Owen? Sarah?
Yeah, it's actually really been covered related to the system and incentives. And I think what DFID would have loved out of this was for us to just pinpoint this one thing that we could all just work on and just dismantle that. And the only real structural things in place that could discourage were USAID policy and then counterterrorism legislation. And then everything else becomes really messy related to incentives, not just mandates, but missions. And a really good example is actually what was brought up for vouchers. There hasn't been a lot of cash versus vouchers for food consumption outcomes studies, but cash is proving better than food at achieving a lot of food consumption outcomes. Not everywhere, and to get nitty-gritty, some food will be better at calories versus diversity. But when you see cash transfers actually achieving better, food outcomes, and then yet there's still a tendency to relate on being able to find it as an output, so either the food or the voucher for the food. I mean, it really does relate to the fact that even when we have some good ideas that cash can be better at this, it's still perceived as, the World Food Programme's mandate is from the 1960s. I had to dig and dig to find that thing. And it's all about food aid. And I just thought to myself, well, then either our vouchers, therefore outside of it, and cash that they're doing now. But all this is reinterpreted through boards, through policy over time. And WFP's policy is very clearly that cash vouchers and food aid are all tools to achieve, food assistance and outcomes. So it becomes a very tricky discussion, and I think that's where the panel really wanted to push, was to say, look, we can't come up with all the answers here, but is challenging the way things are done, and we think that that's a good thing, and not to say that it'll erase the barriers, but it's certainly providing some unique opportunities to perhaps work a little bit better.
Okay, let's get some more questions from the audience. Lady here first, and then I'll take a question from you, and then a question from that gentleman there. I'll take about 3 questions first. Please say who you are, where you're from, and your question.
Good morning. My name is Rosemary Seguero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow, an organization that focuses on humanitarian. I'm based here in DC, but I'm from Kenya. I also focus more on immigrants and refugees. Looking at your presentation and your report, how are we going to work together looking at the actual resettlement of refugees? Because looking at the money transfer, giving people cash, giving people voucher who are not very well settled, how is this going to work? Why can't we look at resettlement first, looking at housing, where they can have household Tata? So that's how we will get the Tata who are in the refugee. How many are they? How many men? How many children? And whom are we giving? But then even if you give them voucher, where are they going to shop? The vouchers you are giving them, there has to be some kind of mechanism of arrangements of having stores around, malls around, which is not there. So the report needs to include most of it, resettlement of the refugees before we get into money transfer. What are they buying? Where are they buying? And whom are they buying from? This is still a confusion here because there is a problem. A problem is resettlement first before we go into the cash money transfers and giving them voucher.
Thank you very much. That may be a slightly separate issue. We'll see in a minute if the panel have any comments they can make about that. Gentleman behind you in the check shirt, let's get a question from you.
Hi, I'm Meshri, graduate student. So, provided that there is a market and you decided to give cash instead of kind transfers, what's the evidence on how that affects prices, how it affects, you mentioned earlier that the refugees often sell the food. Do you know if they if you give them extra cash, whether they save the cash or they would spend more than they would have spent it normally. And then how do you decide how much cash you give to everybody also? Because if you talk about dignity a lot and giving them, empowering them to do what they want, but you still constrain them with the level of cash you give. And I just want to know how much you decide based on that. And finally, sometimes it's better to have a single payer because it drives the prices down. So imagine you have to buy huge quantities of food, so a single payer is more efficient in that way. Do you know of that overweight or how that efficiency compares to the efficiency of cash? And thank you very much.
Okay, great questions there. Thank you. And let's get a question from this gentleman over here in the corner.
Good morning. My name is John Berg from the Office of U.S. Foreign Assistance Resources. And first, thank you all very much for being here and for the tremendous work of this report. I hate to jump the gun or change subjects or get off track, but now that this incredible work is done, and there's still clearly a lot of work to be done in terms of socializing and advocating, etc., I am curious, bridging what was learned through this report and each of your experiences, how you see this supporting the transfer from crisis to stability, relief to development transition. Could a product like this perhaps inform research in the vein of from unconditional cash transfers to conditional cash transfers? I'm just kind of curious how you see this supporting various modalities in that transfer from relief to stability and development. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Let's take that last question first, actually. Very interesting. How can cash transfers move from crisis to stability, relief to development? Sarah?
Okay, everyone's staring at me, so I've got this one, don't worry.
No pressure.
I mean, the crisis to stability is almost outside of the hands of humanitarian aid. I don't want to say that there's not some opportunities, and I think the whole do no harm framework is still a seminal piece in terms of saying that aid can affect peace and or can affect conflict, for better or for worse. So that one becomes a bit of a question that is almost a challenging one to ask of cash. I mean, I think it's difficult to ask of any humanitarian tool to achieve something that ultimately will require a political solution. But the relief to development, or I would say even less of a transition between relief and development, but more how the interplay of this. So what we're seeing is not so much that it's less that short-term humanitarian cash transfers that are unpredictable, where you don't necessarily know how long they're going to continue, that might use systems that were set up quickly. That makes a pretty poor base for a longer-term, say, cash transfer program. But what we're seeing is actually it's the other way around. In Philippines, you had World Food Program top up a conditional cash transfer program there for 500,000 people after Typhoon Haiyan, because there was a conditional cash transfer program in place. Now, there are implications of that because the people who are part of that, I mean, they had kids because it was for poverty reduction outcomes and school and things of that. So you're leaving out of that group anyone who was affected by Haiyan who didn't have children. So okay, maybe that's not the optimal, but how great is it to essentially be able to build on systems in place, make them more responsive? And if now the Philippines government is looking at, okay, maybe it's not this program that should be used, but how can we tap into some of our long-term existing social programs to be able to deliver humanitarian aid next time? So we're seeing, and given that the relief to development or the synergies between them is such an intractable challenge, one that's been discussed for so many years and is very difficult to achieve in process because of sort of different timelines of aid and different systems used to deliver. It's a really great opportunity. And the other examples would be designing safety nets to achieve this purpose in the first place. So in Philippines, it wasn't designed, but in the Productive Safety Net Program in Ethiopia, the Hunger Safety Net Program in Kenya, actually have systems in place to both bring new people on board and increase the amount of payments. But before we all get super excited about this, the number of places in the world that have humanitarian or that have safety nets, we had a great map up at the ODI presentation. If you look at where most humanitarian aid goes and where most safety nets are, you're not going to be surprised to learn that this isn't a perfect picture. But that doesn't mean that there are not opportunities to kind of look at how you support governments in the first place, either through contingency planning or where safety nets are growing, and they are growing, whether and how those might be used to adjust in times of shock. So it's it's a really interesting question, and thank you so much for bringing that up.
Satwik, did you want to come in?
I just want to add to what Sarah said. I think from a technology perspective, there's a very simple, the fact that I can't do it for everyone, but there are certain people in the world where I can click a button on here and it can put money into that household's account, means that at least at the core we've established the ability to top up, to redeliver cash. There's of course a number of decisions that have to go. There's connectivity issues. There's a number of other financial inclusion issues we have to resolve. But by having that in place, it allows for, by having that in place and by having the systems in place to be able to analyze the impact of the program, to think about the full life cycle of not just delivering cash, but in understanding the impact of the household and working a region through from crisis to stability. I think you have the ability to introduce other actors into the picture at an earlier point than you would otherwise, because you can say, look, we're delivering this program, but we've also built the rails or the plumbing to be able to have incremental funding come in from another donor, from another government, from another NGO, and collaborate on programs in a way that you couldn't before, because that core kind of piping wasn't in place. And I actually think this in part addresses the first question on resettlement, because I think what's underneath that question is that just the delivery isn't important. There's a whole bunch of planning that has to happen up front to actually get to the point where the delivery of cash is going to have an impact. And I think the way to think about that is how do you inform that planning process? How do you make the right decisions about what infrastructure to invest in, about how much cash you're going to need, about what kind of housing materials you're going to need, what kinds of communities, and how can you take lessons from one program and translate them to another? And I think all of that information comes from the fact that you can have these systems in place that follow the full life cycle of a cash program and can take lessons from one and use it to inform the next.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to come in on that, Owen?
Not on this. I want to deal with economics, but if we're still on.
Yeah, I was going to actually move to that previous question then from our graduate student. Meshri was your name? Yeah. That question, yes. What are the evidence of the effect on prices of cash transfers on markets, and how do you decide how much to give people?
So a couple of things. First, let me urge all of you to read the evidence summary prepared by the experts at ODI, which is on our website and on ODI's website, which contains a lot of really good stuff. One of the things that was striking to me was how strong the evidence is that where it's been tried so far, giving people cash doesn't lead to inflation. Guess what? Markets respond. The supply side responds when you give people cash. Entrepreneurs, local suppliers bring product. You only get inflation when supply is unable to respond. Put that against the evidence to the contrary, that when you deliver stuff in kind, you can drive people out of business. You can drive local producers, local farmers, local distributors, local middlemen out of business, because and there's a book by Roger Thorough and Scott Kilman called Plenty, about food aid, especially. They have this story about Ethiopia where food aid trucks are trundling past warehouses where locally grown food is rotting, because that nobody has an incentive to buy that food and distribute it to the people who need it, because we're giving food aid to the affected populations. It's really striking how little we talk about the harm we do to local economies by delivering aid in kind, and yet there isn't evidence of an inflationary effect from giving people cash. On the question of how do you decide, that's a great question, but it's a great question whatever kind of aid you're giving. We have a problem about identification and targeting of beneficiaries, full stop. At the moment, we have a rather complex overlapping system of different organizations and different agencies identifying needs in a very uncoordinated way, often then being responsible for delivering those goods and services and for doing the monitoring evaluation. What the panel said that we would like to see is humanitarian agencies focusing more on the targeting and identification, making sure that the right families, the right people are being targeted, handing off a lot of the delivery of cash to private sector or other experts, and then coming back into the monitoring and evaluation piece. So we do need to strengthen the beneficiary targeting and identification piece. We see cash as one way to enable us to do that. But that isn't, the need to figure out who gets what is not a problem confined to cash. We have that problem however we give aid, and we're not doing it very well in some circumstances. And just finally on the question of the benefits of monopsony buying, of having a single buyer drive down prices. At a discussion similar to this, the Chief of Staff at the World Food Programme said that they thought that in Lebanon at the moment, the World Food Programme was able through local purchasing to drive down prices, he said proudly, by as much as 10%. Well, our evidence suggests that in many cases we're getting efficiency savings of 25-30% by giving people cash. And that's even leaving aside the inefficiency that they might not actually want food, they might want to spend their money on something else. So there's also an inefficiency, a massive inefficiency of giving people something that they want less than something else they could buy. You add that inefficiency as well, and you can estimate how big it is by seeing at what price they sell this stuff. They're selling it at sometimes a third of what it cost us to deliver it to them. There is no way that driving down food prices by monopsony buying is anything like as big as the efficiency gains we get in many circumstances, not all, in many circumstances, by giving people cash.
Okay, Owen, Radha, can you chime in a bit on how you decide how much cash to give people?
So it's usually there's a pretty easy way of working this out that's based on local market assessments and understanding what goes into food baskets, minimum expenditure baskets. So it's a pretty technical but straightforward calculus in the same way that you would think about how many calories does a household need, what needs to go into a food basket. So it's a pretty straightforward assessment, but it is done at the local level in every different context.
Let's get a couple more questions from the audience and see what else we can get in. Hands have gone up over on this side. Let's start with the lady on the front, and then let's go to the gentleman in the blue and the lady in the red.
Hi, my name is Jenny Conniff. I am the Cash Learning Partnership North America focal point. It just started a couple weeks ago, so it's great for us to be in this cash community here in the US. And I wanted to thank the panel for emphasizing some of the perspectives that CALP also has for this high-level panel report, particularly that cash can serve needs beyond basic needs, which supports in many ways Food for Peace's resilience agenda, also moving from response to recovery. I think there are a lot of opportunities within the U.S. humanitarian community, even within the constraints that we have with the current structure and appropriations, to improve on multi-sector assessments. It's a means of perhaps continuing to reinforce this fact that needs are increasing, not just in number of people, but also in quantity, and helping to highlight that advocacy message that humanitarian agencies need on behalf of donors or Congress.
Jenny, just in the interest of time, if there's
Sure.
a question coming, I'm going to ask you to move to the question.
Great. One thing that's come up is this issue of coordination. Cash is not a sector. We need to realize that the recommendations for cash are not necessarily exclusive to cash as a modality. They could also apply to vouchers or to food assistance. But the other thing is, with respect to the coordination in the humanitarian environment and the upcoming World Humanitarian Summit, I wonder what you all think. The recommendations for this report are so visionary. What do you think might be predictable or expected outcomes of the upcoming summit?
Okay, great, thank you. Let's quickly get two questions, and both of you, I would encourage you to be concise.
Dan Honig, I'm an assistant professor of international development over at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And my question is, you know, you've all been very clear that cash is not always the answer, right? That there are situations in which cash is not appropriate. But then the conversation is focused on sort of false objections to cash that may not hold water around efficiency, around leakage, around targeting, et cetera. When ought we not engage in cash? What are the limits of this modality? Thank you.
Okay, and the lady in red.
Hi, Rachel, OpenCastleWiki. I'm not currently affiliated. I'm really interested. There's been a couple of mentions of households, and we know that in refugee times, households are very unstable. And someone also mentioned women and how cash transfer might have some ability to empower women in refugee situations. And I'm curious about how that might play out and how we might be able to better reach particularly marginalized or people who have difficulty reaching resources in refugee situations. Thanks.
Okay, great questions. Okay, let's work our way backwards. Let's start with that last question about empowering women and the issues that cash transfers might raise for that. Sarah, do you want to kick us off? And then Dean, I don't know if you have any comments
I'll
about
address
this as
this
well.
one quite quickly. You know, it's a funny one about women, and this kind of links to the previous question about how a lot of this is related to fears, and you know, it becomes a little bit of a discussion. So with women, I think there's been this dual question about, oh my goodness, is this going to really disadvantage women and lead to poor outcomes in households because women might typically control food resources and men might have control over cash resources, and oh dear. And then the other one is going, oh my gosh, this is great. We're going to give women money, and this is going to give them more decision making in the household and going to improve things both for them and, you know, hopefully for their children and outcomes. And the reality is that neither one is really bearing out in evidence. And that's because gender relations are really complicated. You know, they come from a lot of, you know, I'll leave it at that one. But and $50 doesn't really change them. But you still find examples where, you know, where aid agencies are, you know, working specifically to find way in, and women really appreciate that engagement and being able to engage perhaps with financial services where they hadn't before. So that's not to say that there aren't some opportunities, but we kind of have to be quite careful about how we couch questions related to empowerment at a time when people are extraordinarily disempowered. You know, where their options are more limited, where households are more stressed. And the most common finding from research is really that stress increases in households at these times, and that having resources within it is a good thing and can reduce stress. So it's a positive story, but not one that's so positive to go towards the empowerment front.
Dina, the question from Dan from SICE to you, I'm going to put this. When should we not do cash?
Well, I think some of the practitioners might have a longer list, but certainly in places where you don't see markets functioning. There are parts of South Sudan right now, for example, where commercial traders have not been able to access those areas, and it's also been a challenge for humanitarian aid workers. It doesn't really make sense to try to figure out how to get cash into the hands of people if there's not food on those markets, and if you're not able to incentivize the movement of that food, and where you're in a really hot conflict, that may or may not be the case. I think Somalia is a circumstance where there were opportunities to incentivize that, but there are some cases where it's not possible. So I think there are also cases where it depends on what your program objective is. If you're really looking for a nutrition outcome, there's some indication that providing cash with a nutritional supplement targeted towards a vulnerable, towards a malnourished child or towards children under 2 is an important dimension of it. So I think certainly issues around protection, other things that are, cash isn't the right vehicle, but I would refer to IRC if they want to add any other dimensions about where not to do
I
it.
actually am not sure I would add. I might challenge some of them, because I think we do have, because I think the most common responses are where markets aren't functioning or where security doesn't allow. You know, there's certainly the programmatic pieces or protection concerns that we want to be aware of, but I think sometimes those are inflated, and that we're not pushing hard enough to understand what potentially might draw. We know that we've always done market assessments before using cash. So we've tried to understand what the kind of elasticity of those markets are and what supply chains are capable of doing. We haven't really explored fully enough what cash could do to incentivize improved supply chain functioning, or to incentivize the draw of traders. I think Greece is a great example right now, but there are many others. So I would say that Dina's list is the right one, but I think it's one that we still need to push a little bit further and build out further research and evidence around.
So there are some really good market assessment frameworks out there, and as a panel, we felt we didn't need to reinvent that wheel and develop our own framework. We could point to those. What we did feel was that we wanted to change the presumption. Those who argue that markets would not respond to people with cash need to demonstrate why they think that. And I think there is too strong a tendency in the community to assume that markets won't respond, can't respond. There's no food in the shops, therefore there's no point in providing people with cash. Well, maybe if people had cash in their pockets, there would be food in the shops. And that has been the experience in many circumstances. So for me, the key thing is to change the presumption. Yes, you have to ask that question. There are obviously some goods, vaccinations would be one of them, some security services, that are either public goods or have such strong positive externalities that the market won't sufficiently provide them, where it just doesn't make sense to provide people with cash to meet those needs. You need, in some cases, to provide those in kind. Some nutritional supplements might have the same characteristics. But for provision of basic needs, often cash is going to work. Now you need to monitor that, and we need to learn what circumstances it works and what doesn't. But the critical thing is to change the presumption and start off by assuming that cash is going to work, and then let's learn about the small number of situations where it isn't going to work.
Okay, before we quickly go ahead.
I think I might draw a distinction between conflict-affected areas and more stable settings. I mean, certainly where we have refugees who've been in the same place for a decade, for us to think that if you don't think about a different model, I think there's huge amount of missed opportunity, particularly around protracted refugee crises. That's an area where I think we should be pushing very hard. I think in conflict settings, there is a risk. I mean, I think in Somalia, the folks who did transfers of cash also spoke to traders and said, at this time, there is going to be cash. It might be a good idea to show up. You still have to do some work, to drop in with cash, and it doesn't respond. You are risking the lives of people who are waiting for a response. So you'd better do your homework, and you better get it right. So I think So I just have maybe a more nuanced perspective, but in general, I think we're on the same page.
I don't think that's more nuanced, but let me second the thought that market strengthening initiatives. One thing you can do is accompany your move to cash with investing in grain silos or a bit of transport infrastructure that you need to put in place to enable the market to work. Right. So there are things you can do that will enable them, and what you should do is identify those and unblock them, not say, oh, the market's screwed up, let's truck in some food, right? Make the market, if the market isn't working, make it work.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, I just want to, we're going to move to the last question now because we need to wrap up. I think, Owen, I'm going to ask you to answer this question, but use it as a way to give us your kind of final thoughts. It's about the World Humanitarian Summit next May. Given the recommendations, given of this report, what are the opportunities? What are the challenges? What do you hope for from the World Humanitarian Summit as a kind of moment in time to think about this? And we'll use that as a kind of way to wrap up.
Thanks, Rajesh. So I think we do live at a time of extraordinary opportunity. Dean is absolutely right that things have changed, not only the technology and the experience of electronic payment systems, but also the changing nature of the humanitarian problem. We have many more people now in urban areas, refugees in urban areas than used to be the case, places where markets can be expected to function. Many more refugees in middle-income countries than used to be the case, again, where markets can be expected to function. And we've got this growing body of evidence about the effectiveness of cash. So it really is time now, whatever was holding us back, to move this forward. And I don't think we need to wait, actually, until the World Humanitarian Summit. I think not all donors are in a position to do this, and we've heard about some of the congressional obstacles in this country. But donors like DFID and ECHO can and I think should now get on with signalling clearly to the international system that they're in the market to pay for humanitarian cash transfers, where those transfers are going to be more effective, more cost effective, and restore dignity to people. Because I think as we see this succeeding around the world, people will begin to understand that this is a more natural state of affairs. And I say that with this thought in mind. Imagine, God forbid, that this happened to you, that you're flooded out of your house, or there's some conflict, or there's some catastrophe. You wouldn't want to be queuing up for hours to get food off the back of a truck in some refugee camp. You would want to have money to enable you to decide what you want to buy, when you want to buy it, who you want to buy it from, what your priorities are. And I think there is a problem a bit that we tend to other the refugees and the people that the humanitarian system is trying to help. We imagine that they are not like us, when in many cases they are just like us, except they have been very badly affected by conflict or some other catastrophe. And I think we have to begin to shift the discussion to understand that, and to understand that it's just not acceptable at a time of very, very scarce resources that we waste so much delivering aid inefficiently. I completely agree. In fact, my opening sentence when the feedback would let me speak was that moving to cash doesn't solve all these problems. A fundamental problem with the humanitarian system is that there's not enough resources going into it. And I also agree that European governments have been slow to understand that. So I want European governments to come to the World Humanitarian Summit committed to spending more on humanitarian aid. And I think as climate-related problems grow, this need is going to grow, not shrink. So we really have to be committed to putting more resources in. But if we're going to put more resources in, we have to not have a dysfunctional system. And cash really gives us an opportunity not only to individually improve our response, but also to begin to drive change through the system, to reduce duplication, to reduce some of the costs. And for that to happen, we do need, I think, the donors to come together to say, we want to buy a different kind of response than the response we're getting now. And I think the system will react pretty quickly. I'm an economist. I believe that people respond to incentives. And I think if those incentives are out there, organizations can and should come together. What we don't want is a single UN cash organization responsible for delivering cash. What we want to do is create opportunities for coalitions to come together, private sector organizations like IRC, international organizations, to form coalitions to solve these problems, to innovate, to drive change. And for that to happen, the donors have to dangle the bait to enable those coalitions to form, to enable them to invest in the changes they need to make within their organizations and to work together. It really does come down to the purchasers here, the donors, to decide that this is what they want to do. And then let's see how much innovation and change we can drive through the system. I think the opportunities are huge. That's what I hope will come out of the World Humanitarian Summit.
Okay, good point to finish. The report is on our website and on ODI's website as well. Just want to also point you to the fact that this morning we launched a brand new report on the unintended consequences of anti-money laundering policies on people in poor countries. Just to give that a plug. That is on our website today. There'll be an event here on Thursday with Nathan Sheets, the Undersecretary of Treasury for International Affairs, to talk about that report. But I'm going to invite you now to say thank you to our panel today for an excellent discussion. Thank you.